It was March 19, 1945, and First Lieutenant Grant Stout, in his P-47 Thunderbolt, was returning from a dive bombing mission over Germany. He spotted a train on the ground and went down to strafe it, but just moments later, his fighter was seen coming apart in the air, and his parachute opened before the wreck hit the ground. He was never seen again. The truth would surface only years later, and what came out would haunt his family back in the United States. The darker part is that he wasn't the only one to meet such a fate. You'll see what happened through the story of the P-47 Thunderbolt. Let's set the stage first. In the years before World War II, US air power doctrine was obsessed with long-range bombers. They were convinced that the war could be won from the air, bombing the enemy's ability to wage war to dust by destroying their infrastructure and factories. So they poured their attention into big bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress, while the fighters, at the time called pursuit planes, were envisioned as something entirely else. They were intended to be short-range interceptors to protect the mainland in case of enemy air attack. And since that was considered less likely to happen, less attention was given to them. Because of that, the United States was quite behind in fighter technology, while the Germans were doing the complete opposite and prepared the Bf-109 for the new war, which could easily be said was the best fighter in the world when it first appeared. US fighter squadrons had P-40 Warhawks and P-39 Airacobras, which were decent, but obviously well behind in performance and firepower. Then war erupted in 1939, and German Bf-109s and British Spitfires showed just how important fighters were. As expectations that bomber formations with onboard machine guns for protection would be safe were soon to be shattered, the United States began to scramble for a new fighter. So, a brilliant engineer, Alexander Kartveli, took up the challenge and first created the P-35 and then the P-43 Lancer. However, these were quite mediocre and quickly outclassed, but Kartveli wasn't done, and he went back to the drawing board to create a fighter with unprecedented power, speed, and endurance. You know, in theory. However, he would do something quite interesting. At the time, fighters were designed to be as light and slick as possible, with smaller water-cooled engines at the front. You see, their only form of protection was speed and maneuverability, and basically a single machine gun round that went through the radiator would ruin the day for the pilot and his fighter. Coolant would spill out, the engine would quickly overheat, and that was it. Now, Alexander flipped this lightweight concept upside down, quite literally, and designed the biggest and heaviest single-engine fighter of the Second World War. He would also start first with the engine and supercharger system, then make the plane around it. The prototype he came up with, the XP-47, was designed around a massive 18-cylinder, air-cooled Pratt & Whitney double Wasp engine, which was paired with nothing smaller than a turbo supercharger system tucked in the fuselage. Now, this engine, outputting over 2,000 horsepower, had an ingenious system that would boost its performance at high altitudes. Just for scale, this engine had a 46-litre displacement compared to the Spitfires and later the Mustang's Merlin engine that had 27 litres. It weighed over 7 tons fully loaded, which was over 50% more than the Spitfire, and this weight created a wide range of problems at first. It was sluggish on climb, and the first razorback spine severely limited the pilot's rearward view, which is something you absolutely wouldn't want in a dogfight. To make matters even worse, the promising prototype crashed due to structural failure, but they persisted, painstakingly solving one problem after another until the P-47 Thunderbolt was finally born. Now, one of the most striking things about the Thunderbolt was that supercharger system. If you're not an aircraft nerd, you can skip the next 20 seconds, but I think it'd be interesting to explain. You see, instead of putting the supercharger in the nose like most fighters, engineers tucked it all the way back in the fuselage. Air entered through a scoop under the nose, which was so large that a man could climb inside. From there, the air traveled down long ducts, stretching to the rear of the plane. Then it split in two. One stream went to the supercharger impeller, was compressed and carried forward again into the carburetor, while the other stream passed through an intercooler before it rejoined the flow back to the engine. The supercharger itself drew its power from hot exhaust gases. This meant that by 27,000 feet, the engine was still breathing compressed air, which meant the Thunderbolt could fight with the same performance where many other aircraft struggled with thin air and their performance dropped. That system under the cockpit also acted like a cushion in crash landings, and the smooth belly kept the plane from flipping over. It could also absorb bullets in combat and rarely caused immediate disaster. The fuel tanks under the pilot were self-sealing, and the cockpit carried armoured plates both in front and behind. So together with the air-cooled engine, which couldn't be taken out with a single bullet like the Merlin, and coupled with the strong wing structure that stayed intact under heavy fire, the Thunderbolt gained a reputation for being notoriously hard to kill. There would soon be many examples of Thunderbolts returning from missions with half their cylinder heads or entire wing sections missing, and still somehow reaching the base. They would be coming back from missions riddled with bullet holes, surviving even 20 and 30mm cannon fire. However, a lot of them would go down in Normandy when their main purpose changed, and for those that survived the unwanted landing, new horrors awaited. We'll get to that in a moment, but let's first take a look at weapons. The P-47 carried serious firepower for the time. Each wing held 4 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, so 8 in total, each one with 350 rounds. When all 8 fired together, they spat out about 100 rounds per second, and recoil alone could slow the airplane by 30 miles per hour. However, the trade-off was that ammunition only lasted about 35 seconds of continuous fire, so pilots would learn quickly to watch the trigger. Even so, those guns were only part of the package. The Thunderbolt could haul more than 1,100 kilograms of bombs or rockets under its wings, which made it the heaviest-hitting single-engine fighter of the entire war. And frankly, since that loadout turned it into a natural fighter-bomber, you can already sense that its most destructive role was still ahead, as well as the darkest period for its pilots. Thunderbolt's combat debut came in March 1943, but the mission failed due to bad weather and problems with radio communication. However, just a few days later, the Thunderbolt scored its first aerial victory, and no less than the much-feared German Focke-Wulf 190. Pilots who had been flying slick and nimble Spitfires at first were not impressed by the 3 times heavier fighter, and you can understand the skepticism. But the Thunderbolt functioned completely differently, using pure horsepower and stability rather than the agility pilots were used to. Once those strengths were understood, the Thunderbolt became one of the favorite fighters. After Europe, the Thunderbolt quickly spread across the Mediterranean and Pacific theaters. Now, initial models had some serious issues in combat, the first being its propeller, which wasn't well matched with the engine. Despite having a powerful, almost 3,000 horsepower engine in improved versions, it couldn't use that power with the early propeller, which gave it quite a poor climb rate and especially weak low-altitude performance. German pilots quickly learned to exploit this weakness, and if the dogfight didn't favor their terms, they would simply go into a steep climb and leave the Thunderbolts behind, unable to follow. This was solved later with a wider so-called paddle propeller that unlocked the engine's full potential and improved climb rates significantly. But another thing was introduced that would come as a nasty surprise for German pilots. It was a water injection system, basically a 30-gallon alcohol-water tank mixture. Injecting this mixture gave the engine about 1/3 more power for a short time that the pilot could use in an emergency to gain an advantage. Also, German fighters couldn't follow the Thunderbolt in a vertical dive at over 500 miles per hour without tearing their wings apart, while the Thunderbolt could sustain such Gs because of its rough structure. Pilots would use this tactic when in trouble. And one thing the Thunderbolt could do that no other fighter could was take a massive beating and survive. One time, a Thunderbolt took 5 direct 20mm cannon hits in one wing and survived. Lieutenant Robert Johnson's Thunderbolt, for example, was riddled by 20 cannon shells and over 100 machine gun rounds. With a shattered canopy, a fuselage like Swiss cheese, and himself wounded, he was still flying. The German ace who ambushed him was so stunned that it wouldn't go down that he pulled alongside the crippled Thunderbolt after expending all his ammunition, gave a salute, and broke off, while Johnson made it back to Allied lines. Because of stories like this, and the cockpit being much bigger than other fighters, pilots joked that when attacked, you could unstrap your harness and run around the cockpit to dodge bullets. The bubble canopy soon came as a major improvement, making visibility much better, which was more than important in dogfights. Now, the Thunderbolt was a much more dangerous and capable bird. One problem that haunted the P-47 the whole time was its fuel consumption. It was quite a thirsty plane, with about 1.5 to 2 hours of flight time, with 305 gallons of fuel in internal tanks. It had about 50 miles more range than the Spitfire, but it wasn't suitable for bomber escort missions, for which it was needed. Drop tanks improved range, with belly-mounted 75 and later 108-gallon tanks that could be jettisoned when empty, or in case of a dogfight, but still it was nowhere near the range they needed to follow bombers on missions deep into enemy territory. The P-51 Mustang would come as the ideal solution and take over this role, while the Thunderbolt would now focus on something different and perhaps even more dangerous, the role that would define what was about to happen to its pilots, and that's the ground attack role. Because of its tough constitution and capability to carry a heavy payload, the Thunderbolt was just ideal for ground attack and close air support roles. But this was a very dangerous job, as they were flying extremely low to the ground, where they were in range of every anti-aircraft weapon. As 1944 went on, Thunderbolts excelled at strafing and bombing runs, devastating any movements of the German army on the ground. In addition to its 8 heavy machine guns, it could carry 2,500 pounds of bombs or rockets and dive at high speed to drop the payload accurately, so the Germans eventually became reluctant to move vehicles in daylight. But the Germans weren't just standing with crossed hands, doing nothing to stop this. Anti-aircraft fire was always dangerous, no matter how hard the Thunderbolt was to kill. Although their chances of surviving combat were relatively good, plenty of Thunderbolt pilots went down or had to bail out deep in enemy territory, where their great success in ground attacks on Germans didn't help them. Now, in an ideal world, under the Geneva Conventions, an airman who parachuted down and surrendered should be treated as a POW, with all the protections the conventions describe. But although that's what happened in many cases, we don't live in the ideal world, and pilots were not always treated as they should. Usually, either German Wehrmacht soldiers or local police would apprehend the downed pilot and send him through prisoner of war camps, where most of them waited until the end of the war, not in ideal conditions, quite bored, but alive. However, there was another way this could go. By 1944, outraged civilians who were greatly affected by Allied bombing campaigns, and of course ground attacks, were starting to take justice into their own hands. German cities were pounded by the British and American joint bombing campaign, and civilians were suffering terribly, with huge numbers of the population killed and shortages of food and necessities because of the bombing. Now, to add to this, fighter bombers like the Thunderbolt were attacking everything that moved, like trains, convoys, and even farms suspected of hiding military equipment. To the German population on the ground, Allied airmen were not looked upon with sympathy, and for a good reason, and we can't blame them. Nazi propaganda only fueled this hatred even more, as Allied airmen were labelled Terrorflieger or Luftgangster, deserving no mercy. There are even data suggesting that Hitler discussed executing captured Allied airmen officially, but they didn't dare to cross the Geneva Conventions that much. Instead, Nazi officials were more or less turning a blind eye and letting the angry mob do as it pleased. Some German civilians were literally actively hunting down Allied pilots, many of whom were Thunderbolt pilots, as they had quite a big chance of getting hit in their risky low-level attacks. On March 19, 1945, First Lieutenant Grant Stout, a Thunderbolt pilot, was shot down near the German city of Dortmund. He managed to bail out, landing somewhat safely under his parachute, but was immediately taken prisoner by Luftwaffe personnel who had been operating a local flak battery. That should have meant captivity, interrogation, and eventually a POW camp. Instead, what followed became a dark example of how discipline inside Germany was breaking down in the final months of the war. According to testimony gathered after the war, the German battery commander marched Stout into a nearby village, pointed to the captured pilot, and told the crowd something like, "Here's one of the murder pilots, do what you will." Witnesses later described how a mob began horribly beating him until Stout died, by some accounts shot by the Luftwaffe sergeant, by others from the savage beating itself. His body was buried hastily in an unmarked grave outside the village, and it was a couple of years after the war that the real truth was found out during the investigation of hundreds of such examples. In 1947, 4 Germans were tried by a US military tribunal for the murder. Among them, the flak sergeant Georg Meyer, who received a life sentence. Just a few weeks later, on April 13, 1945, another American Thunderbolt pilot, Major William T. Shorty Bales, was on a mission over Saxony. Bales was a decorated combat pilot, already awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, and he had scored several aerial victories, including the rare achievement of shooting down a German Me-262 jet. On this mission, his squadron was attacking German transport targets near the town of Heinichen, when Bales engaged a German twin-engine aircraft and came under heavy ground fire. His P-47 was critically damaged, forcing him to crash land in a field near the small village of Beersdorf. Bales survived the landing with only minor injuries and got out of the cockpit alive, but the timing could not have been worse. Just earlier that day, bombs from his own group's mission had struck Heinichen, causing damage to the town and killing at least 1 civilian. So when the locals saw an American pilot climb out of a downed Thunderbolt, they did not view him as a surrendering soldier. To them, he was the man who had just taken part in bombing their homes. What followed was pieced together later through an American investigation and even reporting by German journalists decades afterward. When Bales approached a small group of locals and tried to give himself up, he was instead shot in the stomach at close range. The villagers then handed him over to members of the local police. He was taken to a hospital in the nearby town before dying of his wounds the next day. Major Bales was just 29 years old. They were just some of such examples. There were, of course, other pilots or bomber crews, and it is estimated about 1,000 such incidents were actually recorded. Many of them were tried for brutality against captured Allied airmen in trials held at Dachau, the former concentration camp turned into a US military court venue. However, we can understand the rage of someone who just lost loved ones and saw their hometown bombed so ruthlessly. But not all Germans did this, of course, and there are many more instances of decency and mercy where villagers helped Allied airmen, or even hid and protected them until authorities arrived. As for the Thunderbolt, it ended its war journey in the Pacific, fighting alongside other famous Allied fighters. By the end of the war, over 15,500 P-47s were produced, more than any other US fighter model. Its pilots flew over 500,000 combat sorties across multiple theaters and are credited with over 3,700 enemy aircraft shot down, a kill count second only to the Mustang. They also strafed and bombed thousands of trains, tens of thousands of trucks, and hundreds of armored vehicles and tanks. They provided infantry direct support and were crucial in establishing a foothold in Europe after D-Day. After the war, a few saw action in Korea, but the era of propeller-driven fighters was over and taken over by the jet age. The successor of the Thunderbolt would come based on its principles, the A-10 Thunderbolt II. It was built on the same concept of not being the fastest jet, but surely extremely hard to kill and heavily armed with a 30mm rotary cannon.